It was a typical bustling day in the heart of Lagos, Nigeria. The city never sleeps, and neither do its streets. From the early morning rush to the late-night hustle, it's a place of unfiltered energy and life. But amidst the usual chaos of traffic, street vendors, and the familiar chorus of honking horns, something unexpected happened. Something that would change the course of one man's day, and maybe even his perspective on life. Big Shaq, the comedian and social media personality known for his viral moments, had just arrived in Lagos for a short visit. He was there to film some new content, enjoy the lively atmosphere, and soak in the vibrant culture of the city. Little did he know, today wouldn't be just another routine trip. Today, he would meet someone who would leave a lasting impression on him, someone he never expected to encounter on the lively streets of Lagos. As he made his way through the busy streets, surrounded by the noise of the city, Big Shaq's attention was suddenly drawn to a woman standing by the roadside. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with a round belly that was unmistakable. A pregnant woman, balancing several baskets of goods on her head, trying to catch the attention of potential buyers passing by. She looked tired but determined, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It wasn't unusual to see street vendors in Lagos, but there was something about her that made Big Shaq pause. It wasn't just the fact that she was pregnant while working on the streets, though that alone was striking enough. It was the way she moved. She navigated the crowded streets with a strength and grace that seemed beyond her years. But beneath that strength, there was also something raw, something vulnerable. In her eyes, Big Shaq could see the struggle of a woman trying to make ends meet for herself and her unborn child, a woman not waiting for the world to hand her a break, but instead creating one with every step she took. As Big Shaq stood there, watching her, he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. He had always been about making people laugh, bringing joy, and creating moments of escape. But in that moment, the humor felt distant. The world he knew, filled with jokes, comedy sketches, and viral trends, felt far away from the raw reality of the woman before him. What was her story? What brought her to this street, carrying all that weight, both literal and metaphorical? Without thinking, he took a step closer. The woman glanced up at him, and for a brief second, their eyes met. She wasn't asking for help, but there was something in that glance that felt like an invitation, an unspoken plea for recognition, for someone to see her beyond the hustle and the struggle. A brief moment of connection that said everything without words. Big Shaq hesitated for a moment. He could have walked on, continued with his day, ignored the situation as just another ordinary encounter on the streets. But something inside him pushed him to act. This wasn't just another moment to pass by. It was a chance to truly make a difference. But what happened next? Did Big Shaq approach her and offer help? Or did he walk away, unsure of what to do? Was this a turning point for him, a new chapter that would change the way he viewed the world around him? Or was it just a brief encounter that would fade away like so many others? Stay tuned, because what happened next was something neither of them could have expected. Something that would leave Big Shaq questioning not just the streets of Lagos, but his own purpose in life. The answer, however, is still just around the corner, waiting to be revealed. Big Shaq took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had been to Lagos before, seen the life of the city from different angles, its nightlife, its energy, its vibrance. But something about the pregnant woman on the street stirred something different in him. It wasn't just her determination to keep going despite the obvious exhaustion. It was the silent strength she radiated. He felt as if she had been standing there all day, all week, all year, fighting for something. What was it? Was it just survival? Or was there more? His gaze lingered on her for a few more moments. The bright yellow and green fabrics wrapped around her body clashed with the noise of the city, but seemed to form a quiet harmony in her presence. Her hands were calloused from years of hard work, the lines on her face telling stories of both hardship and resilience. She wasn't a typical figure he would have noticed, not in a crowd this big. But today was different. Today, his eyes followed her movements as though she held a piece of something he needed to understand. But before he could walk over to her, she was approached by a middle-aged man, dressed in a faded suit that looked too tight for him. He had a quick, impatient manner and spoke in a clipped voice, his words laced with authority. Big Shaq didn't hear the exact conversation, but he could tell it was an argument. The woman stood her ground, her back straight, her face calm but firm. The man gestured towards the baskets on her head, and she shook her head, refusing to move. He spoke again, this time more angrily, and she responded with a shrug, as though the words didn't faze her. Shaq's curiosity deepened. What was going on here? He had seen these kinds of exchanges on the streets before, but this time felt different. Why was this man arguing with her? What did he want from her? And why was she so resolute in her refusal to give in? His hand instinctively reached for his phone, ready to record what seemed like an unfolding drama, but then he stopped himself. Was this the right time to pull out the camera? Was this a moment he should be capturing for content, or was it something more meaningful? His thumb hovered over the screen, unsure. He looked back at the woman, her eyes briefly flicking toward him, as though sensing his presence, and something in that glance told him not to turn this into a spectacle. This wasn't a viral moment to share with the world. It was real life. The man's frustration grew as the conversation dragged on, but the woman didn't flinch. She stood her ground with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. The scene unfolded like a slow-motion film, with the backdrop of Lagos buzzing around them. The distant hum of the city, the sound of honking cars, and street vendors shouting their offers of goods, all blended into the tension in the air. Finally, the man threw his hands up in exasperation, muttered something under his breath, and walked off in the direction of a passing bus. The woman let out a slow breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the conversation had been lifted.
But the moment didn't last.
She quickly adjusted the baskets on her head, picked up her pace, and began hawking her goods once more, like nothing had happened. Big Shaq's heart raced. He didn't know what had just occurred, but it felt like something significant. He wanted to know more about this woman, about the story that had just played out in front of him. The scene had felt like a window into a life Shaq had never known, a life he didn't fully understand, but one that felt powerful in its struggle. But he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't act now, if he didn't talk to her, this moment would pass, and he would never get the answers he was looking for. Something inside him pushed him forward. With his phone still in his pocket, he made his way through the crowd, trying to keep up with the woman as she moved along the busy street. "Excuse me," Shaq called out, his voice barely cutting through the noise of the crowd. She didn't hear him, or maybe she chose not to, her focus fixed on the potential customers passing by. But Shaq wasn't going to let this go that easily. He picked up his pace and called out again, this time louder.
"Excuse me, madam. I
just want to talk for a second." This time, she stopped. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she turned around, her gaze sweeping over him, as if assessing whether he was worth her time. Big Shaq couldn't read her expression. It was neutral, almost unreadable. "Can I help you?" Her voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of someone who had learned not to waste energy on things that didn't matter. Shaq hesitated for a moment. He had no script, no rehearsed lines. This wasn't a comedy bit or an interview. It was real life. "I saw what happened back there," he said slowly. "The man. What was that all about?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's nothing," she said quickly, her hand brushing the air dismissively. "Just business. Nothing to worry about." But Shaq wasn't convinced. There was something in her tone, something that made him feel like he wasn't getting the full story. He took a step closer. "Are you sure? I don't mean to pry, but—" "It's fine," she interrupted, her voice no longer as friendly. "I don't have time for this. I have to sell my goods." With that, she began to walk off again, her pace quickening, clearly eager to leave the conversation behind. But Shaq wasn't going to let it end like that. "Wait," he called out. "Just let me help. Maybe I can." "I don't need your help," she said, turning to face him one last time, her eyes now sharp, as if a warning had been issued. "No one helps me. I've been doing this long before you walked into my life." Shaq stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by the intensity of her response. There was so much more to her story than he had realized, so much more than he could have imagined. What was it about her that made her so defensive, so determined to push away any help. As the woman disappeared into the sea of people, Big Shaq stood there, the weight of her words lingering in the air. What had just happened? And why did he feel so unsettled by the encounter? It wasn't just a random meeting on the streets anymore. It felt like a mystery, one that he wasn't sure he could walk away from so easily. Something told him that the truth about this woman was more complicated than just a pregnant woman hawking on the streets of Lagos. There was more going on here, something deeper, something he needed to understand. And as Shaq stood there, looking out over the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled into a story far bigger than he had ever imagined. A story that might change everything. Big Shaq stood there, feeling the pulse of Lagos beneath his feet. The hum of the city had always fascinated him, the constant noise, the energy, the life. But today, everything felt different. The encounter with the pregnant woman lingered in his mind, like a riddle he couldn't solve. As the crowd moved past him, each person lost in their own world, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just slipped through his fingers. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to let it go. He decided to track her down. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to follow her. It wasn't like him to get so involved in someone else's story, especially not like this. But there was something about the way she had looked at him earlier, something raw and unspoken, that made him feel like he had to do more. He had seen poverty, struggle, and resilience on his travels, but this felt personal. He had been to the streets of Lagos before, but today, the city seemed to hold a secret he wasn't yet ready to uncover. Shaq made his way down the street, weaving through the thick crowds of vendors, busy office workers, and people just going about their daily lives. The woman had disappeared into the crowd, and he wasn't sure where to start. But something told him to go to the market area nearby. It was where most of the street vendors set up shop, brightly colored stalls filled with fruits, clothes, and an array of goods. People were everywhere, bargaining, shouting, and negotiating for the best prices. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos Shaq had come to expect from Lagos. After a few minutes of scanning the market, he saw her again. She was standing at a stall, talking to a customer, her back to him. She had changed the position of her baskets and was balancing them differently now, as if trying to make her goods more presentable. The exhaustion was still there, but there was a quiet determination in the way she moved. She wasn't giving up, not even for a moment. Shaq approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her this time. He waited a few moments, watching her interact with the customer, before deciding to speak again. "Hey," he said gently, his voice not as forceful as it had been before. "I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't mean to upset you." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing again. "What do you want now?" Shaq hesitated, trying to choose his words carefully. I want to understand. Why are you out here, working like this? I mean, you're pregnant. You shouldn't have to do this, right?" The woman's face hardened, her expression turning defensive again. "You don't know anything about my life. You think you can just waltz in and give advice, or offer help. This is how it is. This is my life. I have no other choice." Shaq stood there, surprised by the intensity of her response. There was a story here, a story that went beyond her being a street vendor. Something deeper, something that she wasn't ready to share. But he wasn't going to walk away without trying to understand. "I don't know what it's like," Shaq admitted, "but maybe I can help. I've seen a lot in this city, met a lot of people. I just don't." She cut him off. Her voice was sharp, a mixture of frustration and something else, something vulnerable. "You don't get to fix me. No one does. I've had enough of people trying to save me. I'm not your project." The words stung, more than Shaq expected. But something inside him refused to give up. He wasn't trying to save her, but he could see the struggle in her eyes. The weight of what she carried was more than just the physical baskets on her head. It was something internal, something that was tied to her past, and possibly to the future of the child she was carrying. As the conversation stalled, a new figure appeared at the edge of the market, walking with purpose toward the woman. Shaq watched closely as a tall, thin man dressed in a sharp business suit approached. His walk was confident, his every step deliberate. He was clearly someone important. The woman's face shifted when she saw him. Her expression softened slightly, and she straightened up, as though preparing for something. The man reached her, and without a word, handed her a small envelope. The woman took it quickly, almost with reverence, and tucked it into the folds of her dress. Shaq noticed the shift. The tension that had been hanging in the air seemed to dissipate.
But why? Who was this man?
And what was in that envelope? Without thinking, Shaq took a step forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. What was that? He asked before he could stop himself. The woman's eyes snapped to him, her expression cold again. "It's none of your business," she said sharply, her tone leaving no room for further questions. The man in the suit glanced at Shaq but said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, his presence as commanding as ever. Shaq's mind raced. What was in that envelope? Why had she reacted so differently to him than to the man in the suit? There was something going on here, something that didn't add up. For a moment, the woman stood there, looking down at the envelope in her hand, lost in thought. Then, almost as if realizing she was still being watched, she turned her back to Shaq, resuming her duties as a vendor. Shaq felt a surge of frustration. He needed answers. This wasn't just about a woman selling goods on the street. There was a bigger story here, something more complicated and far more personal than he had initially realized. But every time he thought he was getting closer, she pushed him away. It was clear now, whatever was going on, it wasn't just about survival on the streets. There was a bigger conflict at play, one that was tied to her past, and possibly her future. And Shaq had a feeling that the answers weren't going to come easily. He stood there for a moment longer, the sounds of the market washing over him, but his mind was elsewhere. What was the woman's story? Why was she so resistant to help, and what was in that envelope? The pieces were there, scattered, but he didn't yet have enough to put it all together. And as he watched her fade into the crowd once again, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a puzzle. And he wasn't going to rest until he solved it. Shaq couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was on the verge of something big. The more he thought about the woman, the more he realized he wasn't just witnessing a struggle for survival. There was something deeper, something that connected her to the city, to the streets, in a way he couldn't yet comprehend. It wasn't just about selling goods on the corner. It was about what she was holding on to and the secrets she was carrying, secrets that kept her guarded, kept her isolated. That envelope, it kept haunting him. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over, the brief moment when the man had handed it to her and she had tucked it away so quickly. What was inside? Why had her whole demeanor shifted? She had gone from defensive and standoffish to almost vulnerable. Was it a threat? A promise? Or something far worse? The questions piled up in Shaq's mind, each one gnawing at him, each one driving him further into the unknown. He needed to know more. He couldn't just walk away from this. But how could he get closer to her? She had already made it clear she didn't want his help. Every time he tried to push for answers, she shut him down with walls higher than before. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the crowded streets, Shaq couldn't sit still any longer. He had to find her. He had to understand what was really going on. He had seen the way she interacted with the people around her, like a woman who had lived through things no one should have to experience. She wasn't just a vendor. She wasn't just a woman trying to make ends meet. There was a past, a darkness, something lurking beneath the surface. As night fell, the streets of Lagos became even more alive, the rush of people weaving in and out, the city's energy never slowing. Shaq moved through the crowd, determined. He kept his eyes peeled for any sign of her. He had a feeling she wouldn't be at the market after dark, but maybe he could catch her on her way home, or wherever she went when the selling was done. He walked for what felt like hours, his feet aching, the city's noise pressing in on him. But then, just as he was about to give up, he spotted her. She was walking down a narrow alleyway, her head down, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though trying to protect something fragile. The baskets she had been carrying earlier were gone, but her pace was hurried, almost frantic. Shaq hesitated, unsure whether he should approach her again. He had pushed her away once already. Would she be willing to talk now? Or would she just get angry? But there was no turning back.
He needed to know what was going on.
Hey, he called out softly, making sure not to startle her. She stopped abruptly, and for a moment, Shaq wasn't sure if she had even heard him. But then she turned slowly, her face pale in the dim light of the alley. "What do you want now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before but still guarded, wary. I need to understand," Shaq said, his voice gentle but insistent. "You don't have to tell me everything, but whatever it is, I think it's bigger than what you're letting on. I'm not trying to help you like some charity case. I just want to know what's going on. What's in that envelope?"
Who was that man?
"You're carrying something, and I can see it. You don't have to carry it alone." For a long moment, she said nothing. Her eyes flickered with something, hesitation, maybe fear. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "You don't get it," she whispered. "You don't understand what it's like to have no one. To have nothing." Shaq stepped forward, but she held up a hand to stop him. "No," she said more forcefully this time. "You can't just come in and think you know everything. People like me, we don't get help. We survive. That's it." He took a deep breath. "Then let me help you survive, not just get by. You don't have to do this on your own." For a split second, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a mix of longing and something else, something she wasn't ready to confront. And just as quickly, it was gone. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I can't let anyone in." Shaq stepped back, trying to process her words. But then, just as he was about to speak again, the sound of footsteps echoed in the alley. The woman froze, her body stiffening in an instant. Her eyes darted to the end of the alley, where a figure was emerging from the shadows. It was the man in the suit, the same man who had handed her the envelope earlier. Shaq's heart skipped a beat. Why was he back? What was going on between these two? The man's presence felt like an unspoken threat, and Shaq could see that the woman was scared, terrified, even. She backed away slowly, her eyes wide, as if she was trying to escape without making a sound. The man approached, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from the woman to Shaq, narrowing ever so slightly. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with authority. Shaq didn't answer right away. He didn't know what to say. But there was something about the way the man spoke, something about the control in his tone, that made Shaq uneasy. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was planned. The woman glanced nervously between them, her body tense, as though she was preparing to bolt at any moment. But she didn't. She stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the man. "You should leave," the man said, his gaze now fully on Shaq. "This doesn't concern you." But Shaq wasn't backing down. He wasn't sure what was going on, but the sense of urgency, the tension in the air, was palpable. He could feel the gravity of the situation, the storm that was about to break. Whatever had brought him to this moment, it wasn't over. Not yet. The woman's eyes flicked to Shaq one last time, and in that fleeting glance, he saw the pain she had been hiding, the thing she was trying to protect. And for the first time, Shaq understood. She wasn't just a street vendor trying to survive. She was in the middle of something much bigger, something dangerous, and he was standing right in the middle of it. The air between Shaq and the man in the suit was thick with tension. The woman stood still, almost trembling, her eyes darting between them, as if searching for a way out. Shaq could feel the pulse of danger rising, like the quiet before a storm. He had a feeling this wasn't just about the woman anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever she had gotten herself involved in, was much bigger than he'd anticipated. The man in the suit stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Shaq. There was no warmth in his eyes, only calculation and cold authority. "I said, you should leave," he repeated, his voice low but commanding. Shaq stood his ground. He wasn't about to back off now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until I know what's going on." The man's lips curled into a slight, almost mocking smile. "You think you can handle this? You think you can just walk into a situation like this and make it better? You don't know what you're dealing with." Shaq's pulse quickened. His instincts screamed at him to be careful, but He couldn't walk away now. Not when everything inside him was telling him that this moment, this confrontation, was the key to everything. Without warning, the man raised his hand. For a split second, Shaq braced himself for whatever might come next, but the man simply pointed. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice dripping with a quiet menace. Shaq followed his gesture and looked down the alley, into the shadows where the man had pointed. At first, he saw nothing but the fading light of the city, the streets blurring with the last traces of sunset. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A figure, another person, emerging from the darkness. They were walking toward them slowly, their silhouette barely visible. Shaq's heart skipped a beat. Something about this new figure felt wrong. It wasn't just a passerby. It was as if the whole scene had shifted, like the ground had tilted under his feet. The woman, now visibly more anxious, took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Shaq could see that she knew exactly who this was, and so did the man in the suit. The figure stepped closer, and as the last light of the evening flickered out, the shadows parted to reveal a second man, dressed in all black, his face obscured by a mask. But it wasn't just the mask that unsettled Shaq. It was the way the man moved, calm, confident, as if nothing in the world could touch him. Shaq's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a simple street vendor caught in a web of survival. This was something else entirely. The woman's hands shook as she reached into her pocket, pulling out the envelope she'd hidden so carefully earlier. She looked at it for a long moment before handing it to the masked man, her face pale. The man in the suit watched, his eyes never leaving the exchange. Shaq tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but it was like piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Why had she handed the envelope over? What was in it that was so important? And why were these two men so intent on making sure she had it? Without a word, the masked man examined the envelope, his fingers brushing over it as if it were something delicate, precious. Then, slowly, he opened it, revealing a stack of papers inside. Shaq couldn't see the details from where he stood, but the woman's expression tightened as if she were holding her breath. This was a moment that could change everything. The man in the suit spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is your final chance. You can either take what you've earned and walk away, or you can keep digging and find out what happens when you get too deep." Shaq's mind raced. Earned? What had the woman done? Was this about money? Information? The stakes were rising higher, and Shaq had a sinking feeling that he had stumbled into something much darker than he could ever have imagined. The masked man folded the papers and slipped them back into the envelope, tucking it into his jacket. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice cold. Then, with a quick motion, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows from where he had come. The woman watched him go, her eyes filled with something like resignation, but there was still fear in them. Fear that hadn't gone away. For a moment, everything was silent. The street was still buzzing with life, but it felt distant now, as if Shaq were in a separate world, one where the rules were different. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever deal had just been made, was bigger than any of them. And the woman? She was caught in the middle of it, just like him. The man in the suit stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're getting in too deep. You need to walk away, while you still can." Shaq's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't going anywhere.
Not now.
Not after everything he had seen. "What's really going on here?" he demanded. "What is she involved in?" The man studied him for a moment, as if weighing his options. "She's in this because she doesn't have a choice. She's working off a debt that she can never repay. People like her, people like you, they're disposable. But she..." The man paused, glancing at the woman, who had now backed up against the wall, as if trying to disappear. "She's caught up in something much bigger. You should leave while you still have the chance." Shaq didn't move. His mind was racing. This was a threat, no doubt, but it was more than that. This was a warning to stay out of something that was far beyond him. But he wasn't about to back down now. Something inside him pushed him forward, a sense that he couldn't walk away from this. Not until he knew everything. The woman, now shaking with the weight of the moment, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't understand," she said, her eyes pleading with him, as if begging him to leave. "You don't know what's at stake. Please just go." Shaq hesitated, the conflicting emotions swirling inside him. What was she so afraid of? What was he about to uncover? The suspense, the fear, the rising tension, it was all coming to a head. But before he could respond, the man in the suit spoke again, his tone sharp and final. "This is your last warning," he said, stepping closer. "You have no idea what you're messing with." With that, Shaq realized that whatever had just happened, whatever he was about to get involved in, it was much bigger than him. And as the man turned and walked away, Shaq knew that the real story, the one that could change everything, was just beginning. Shaq stood there, watching the man in the suit disappear into the dark alley. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of confusion and determination surging through him. He had been warned, threatened even, but there was no turning back now. He could see the fear in the woman's eyes, but there was something else there too, something more vulnerable, like she was begging him to understand. Without thinking, Shaq took a step forward. "I'm not going anywhere until I get the truth," he said, his voice firm. "I need to know what's going on here." The woman shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Please," she whispered. "You don't understand what you're up against. These people, this isn't just about money or survival. It's about power. Power that can destroy everything." Shaq felt his stomach churn. Every word she said was like a piece of a puzzle, but the picture was still so blurry. He needed to know more. "Tell me what they're doing to you. What's in that envelope? Who are these people?" For a long moment, the woman didn't answer. She just stood there, her eyes filled with regret and pain, until finally, she spoke. "I wasn't always like this. I used to have a family, a life. But then they came for us. They came for me." Her voice cracked, the weight of her past haunting every word. "The envelope," she paused, swallowing hard. "It's not just money. It's a contract. A deal I made to keep my family safe. A deal I never should have made." Shaq's breath hitched.
A deal?
"What kind of deal?" She hesitated, looking around nervously, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "I'm working for them. I don't have a choice. They've got leverage over me, over everything. If I don't deliver, they'll hurt the people I love. They'll take everything from me." Shaq felt the pieces fall into place, the understanding hitting him like a ton of bricks. The woman wasn't just a street hawker trying to make a living. She was part of a larger operation, one that involved dangerous people and dark secrets. The envelope contained more than just instructions. It was a symbol of her binding agreement to whatever sinister forces had pulled her in. But the truth didn't make it any easier to stomach. Before he could process all of this, there was another sound behind them. The same masked figure from earlier appeared again, this time with a few more men in tow. They moved quickly, like shadows slipping through the night, and Shaq's instinct screamed at him to run. The woman gasped, stepping back, but the masked man raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed entirely on Shaq, and there was a coldness in his eyes that sent a chill down Shaq's spine. "You're still here," the man said, his voice low and almost disappointed. "Didn't you listen to my warning?" Shaq stood his ground, his mind racing. He had to find a way out. He had to help her, but how could he go up against these people? He wasn't prepared for this kind of fight. But the woman, she needed him. He couldn't walk away now. "What are you going to do to her?" Shaq asked, his voice steady despite the fear creeping in. The masked man smirked, his hands tucked into his pockets as he regarded Shaq with a cool expression. "Nothing yet. But if you keep interfering, things might get complicated." Just as the tension in the air reached its peak, there was an unexpected sound, a siren. A distant wail that echoed through the streets. Shaq's heart leaped. Police?
But why now?
Why had the siren gone off at the exact moment when everything seemed about to spiral out of control? The masked man's eyes flickered, a flash of something, surprise, maybe? It was hard to tell under the mask, but whatever it was enough to make him hesitate for just a moment. That was all Shaq needed. In that split second of uncertainty, Shaq grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her into the shadows, dragging her away from the men and into the narrow alley behind them. The woman stumbled but kept up, her breath quick and shallow, as they ran through the winding streets. They didn't stop until they reached a small, hidden courtyard, breathing heavily in the silence. Shaq looked around, his heart still pounding. He could still hear the sirens in the distance, but they were getting fainter, lost in the labyrinth of the city. "What just happened?" the woman whispered, looking around as though expecting someone to jump out at them at any moment. "How did you?" Shaq didn't know how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. "But we're not safe yet." She nodded, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the alley, as if waiting for someone to come after them. "It's not over," she said. "They'll come for me. They won't stop. Not until I pay the price for what I've done." Shaq swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the woman took something out from under her jacket, a small, nondescript phone. She flipped it open and dialed a number, her hands shaking. When the call connected, her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible.
"It's done," she said.
"I gave them the papers. It's all over.
I
need to get out." Shaq stared at her, his stomach dropping. "Who are you calling?" he asked, though he was already afraid of the answer. She met his gaze, her face filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "The people I made the deal with," she whispered. "The ones who can make sure I'm safe. The ones who can make sure my family is safe." Shaq's mind reeled. This was bigger than he thought. Whatever was in that envelope, whatever she had just done, it was part of something even more dangerous. But the phone call wasn't just a lifeline. It was the final piece of the puzzle that he didn't expect. The woman hung up the phone, her eyes wide with a mix of dread and uncertainty. "It's too late," she said quietly. "They already know about you." Before Shaq could react, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble as a black SUV screeched to a halt in the alley. The door swung open, revealing several figures dressed in suits. But as they stepped forward into the dim light, Shaq realized something that stopped his heart cold. They weren't enemies. They were allies. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, stepped toward him, her face tight with urgency. "You're in deeper than you realize," she said, her voice stern. "We've been watching. And now it's time for you to choose." And just like that, Shaq's world tilted again. The truth had come out, but it only raised more questions. What had he stumbled into? What was the woman really involved in? And who were these people, suddenly offering him a choice? As the SUV door slammed shut, the city of Lagos felt smaller, its secrets growing ever more dangerous, and Shaq realized that his journey was far from over. The story, it seemed, was only just beginning. Shaq stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The woman with the phone call, the mysterious figures in suits, it was all a whirlwind that had left his head spinning. But one thing was clear. He had walked into something that he was never prepared for. The tall woman in the suit, who had spoken first, stepped closer to Shaq. Her expression was serious, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You need to come with us," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is bigger than anything you've seen so far." Shaq looked at the woman, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. He had come here with the intention of helping, of making a difference. But now, it seemed like every step he took only dragged him deeper into a web of danger, secrecy, and betrayal. He was in too deep. He couldn't back out now. But was he ready to face whatever lay ahead? "You don't have a choice, do you?" Shaq asked, his voice quiet but resolute. The woman shook her head.
"Not really," she replied.
"But you still have an opportunity to make it out of this alive. Come with us. We'll explain everything." Shaq turned to the woman he'd been trying to help, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. He had no idea how to fix her situation or what she had gotten herself into, but he couldn't leave her behind. "You're not alone in this," he told her, his voice soft but determined. She nodded slowly, her expression one of gratitude mixed with terror. "I never asked for any of this," she whispered. "But now I'm too far gone. There's no turning back." As the figures in suits ushered Shaq and the woman toward the waiting SUV, Shaq's heart beat faster. The tension, the fear, it was thick in the air, but now, there was no turning back. The SUV door slammed shut, and the vehicle roared to life, driving them into the unknown. The ride felt longer than it was, each minute dragging by in silence as they made their way out of the heart of Lagos, leaving behind the busy streets and the chaos of the city. Shaq tried to steady his breathing, but the questions kept coming, relentless and without answers. Finally, the SUV came to a stop in front of a sleek, modern building hidden in a quiet part of the city. The kind of building that looked ordinary on the outside but screamed power and control. As they got out, the tall woman led them inside, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Wait here," she instructed, and Shaq was left with the woman in the darkened lobby, the silence between them heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "Why are they helping us?" Shaq finally asked, breaking the quiet. "What do they want from me?" The woman hesitated before answering. "They don't help people unless they want something in return," she said. "But what I'm trying to say is, this is your chance. You can walk away if you want to, but I can't." Shaq watched her closely. There was something in her eyes, something raw and real. She wasn't just a victim. She had become part of something far larger, far more dangerous than either of them could have anticipated. And now, Shaq was tangled in it too. A door opened, and the tall woman stepped back, motioning for them to follow. Shaq didn't know what to expect, but as they entered a glass-walled conference room, he saw the figures from earlier gathered around a sleek table, their faces unreadable. One of them, the man who had been with the woman earlier, stood by the window, looking out over the city. "Sit," the tall woman ordered. Shaq took a seat, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of the situation. The room was tense. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something. "You've made it this far," the man said, his voice calm but dangerous. "But now we need to make sure you understand what's at stake. You're involved in something that's bigger than you, bigger than anything you could have imagined." The words hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. He'd always known that there was something about the woman, something he hadn't been able to put his finger on, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival on the streets. It was about a system, a force that controlled everything, unseen but omnipresent.